Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend where a hidden child became the hope of a broken land. In the misty shores of Britain, after the old Roman roads had begun to fade and rival kings fought for power, one boy was carried away from the world that should have known his name. He grew up without a crown, without a throne, and without the truth of his birth. Yet somewhere beyond the quiet walls of his childhood, a sword waited in stone, a kingdom waited in fear, and a strange old prophet watched the path of fate begin to open. This is the story of Arthur, the boy who drew the impossible sword, the king who dreamed of justice, and the man who learned that even the brightest kingdom could cast a shadow. Around him gathered knights, queens, sorcerers, friends, and enemies whose choices would shape Camelot's rise and fall. There would be loyalty, love, betrayal, sacred quests, lost magic, and a final mist-covered shore where history became legend. So let your mind drift toward ancient Britain, where every castle held a secret, every lake remembered a vow, and every crown carried a price. Before we begin this epic, I have a small request that means a lot to me. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. The greatest reward for all the effort I put into creating these epics is your support through subscribing to my channel. If you enjoy my content and want me to continue creating more, your subscription and like truly give me great motivation. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts with me in the comments. Your comments not only encourage me, but also help me understand what kind of epics and stories you would like to see on this channel. Thank you so much in advance for your support. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of this ancient legend guide you, wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of King Arthur, the Crown Behind the Mists, begins now. Britain stood like a tired country on the old Roman roads. Stone bridges still crossed the rivers, grass grew at the foot of abandoned walls, and in villages near the coast, people kept their fires low at night. The kings of the great island did not trust one another. Behind every hill there was another banner, and behind every hall there was another plan. Uther Pendragon was the strongest name in this broken land. He was broad-shouldered, hard-eyed, and used to giving orders. Yet his strength could not cover the emptiness in his heart. On the battlefield he looked calm and cold, but when he returned to the halls of power, he became a weary ruler who followed his desire. The night he first saw Bedegraine, the wife of Duke Gaulois of Cornwall, the noise of the crowd seemed to fall away from him. Only her grave silence remained. Bedegraine carried the wind of Tintagel in her bearing. Her beauty was not loud, the measure in her eyes, the distance she kept when she turned her head, and the dignity with which she stood beside her husband made her different from the brighter women of the court. Uther's admiration soon became an impatience unworthy of a king. Gaulois sensed it and withdrew to Cornwall with his wife. The quarrel that followed was not only between two men. The already fragile balance of Britain was shaken again by the name of one woman. Tintagel rose above hard rocks, where the sea salt dried on the towers. At night the waves struck the hollows below, and the guards in the courtyard mistook every sound in the fog for news. Merlin came into this turmoil as if he had walked out of another age. He did not fully belong to the court or to the wild roads. His cloak carried the smell of wind, and his eyes held the patience of things that had lived longer than men. When he stood beside Uther, he did not show the king victory. He showed him a price. He told Uther that he could enter Tintagel and reach Bedegraine, but the child born from that night would be given to him. Uther paused when he heard the condition, yet his desire moved faster than his thought. Night fell over the coast like a heavy cover. Through Merlin's knowledge, Uther entered the castle in the likeness of Gorlois. The gates opened for him. The rooms believed they knew him. Even the sea seemed to speak more softly under the stones. Bedegraine saw the lines of her husband's face on the man who came to her that night, while fate carried out its work behind that face. News of Gorlois' death reached the castle before the morning fog. The stones of Tintagel seemed to grow colder when the message arrived. Bedegraine would understand the meaning of that night only much later, because courts, mourning, and kings were already lowering heavy curtains over the truth. Uther finally married Bedegraine, but there was more necessity than peace in that marriage. Months later, the child who was born remained in his mother's arms only a short time. He was not a quiet baby. His small fingers held the edge of the blanket, as if he were learning to cling to the world from his first breaths. When Bedegraine drew him close, a pain that did not spill from her eyes passed across her face. It was a pain a mother knew and a queen had to hide. Queen. Merlin came at night. Uther's men waited outside the doors, but inside the room there were more silences than words. Bedegraine looked at the soft line on the baby's forehead. She wanted to give him a name and make him belong to her. Merlin knew that if the child stayed in the court, he would be lost among kings, jealousies, and old crimes. When he reached for the baby, he did not seem cruel. He seemed more like an old shadow, carrying out a duty that weighed on him as well. Uther turned his eyes away. The king who could rule a country with his strength could not bear the weight of his own decision beside that small bed. The baby was wrapped in a cloak. The doors opened quietly. The wind took the warmth from the room at once. The road away from Tintagel did not grow darker. It grew less certain. Merlin held the child carefully on his horse, while the mist from the coast loosened and drifted toward the open land. Behind them, a mother stayed awake in the castle. Ahead of them, the house of Sir Ector waited for a trust it did not yet know. The child would not remember the smell of the room where he was born. He would not know his mother's voice, and for many years he would not hear his father's name. Yet the scattered roads of Britain were already preparing, without knowing it, for his footsteps. As dawn came near, Merlin looked at the baby's face and saw there a silence older than kings. Then he rode inland. The sea remained behind him. Tintagel shrank into the rocks, and the future closed over the name Arthur before anyone had spoken it. Bedegraine's daughters from her earlier life also stood in the silent circle around the new marriage. Morgause, Elaine, and Morgan had learned the balance of courts while still young. They had seen the change in their mother's face, the way men's decisions entered rooms, and the way family names shaped destiny. Morgan was especially quiet. In those days she carried no open threat, but her eyes held the sharpness of a child who noticed what was not being told. Arthur's birth would draw an invisible line through the lives of these girls as well. Kinship waited there like a bond wounded before it had even begun. When Merlin carried the child away, he did more than keep Uther's promise. He also kept Arthur from falling too early into the hands of the claims that would rise from his own family. If the boy grew in the court, someone would teach him a different rite every day, and someone else would whisper a different hatred. In Ector's house he would find cold mornings, simple duties, and steady discipline before titles. Merlin knew this and urged his horse onward. When he looked at the child's unknowing face, he thought how early the future could touch a human life. Sometimes the greatest protection began with a choice as painful as taking a baby away from the place where he belonged. Ector opened the door and let Merlin in without too many questions. That too showed why he had been chosen. Some people rush to know the truth. Others first protect what must be protected. When the baby was brought into the warm room, the air of the house changed. Ector's wife took the child in her arms. She did not first see that he had come from a court. She saw that he was cold. Merlin spoke briefly and carefully. The child had to be raised well, and his past had to remain silent for now. Ector bowed his head. In that moment, the fate of Britain changed direction, not in a great castle, but in a small room beside a fire, through a quiet promise. Sir Ector's house stood far from the glitter of royal halls. Its stone walls were strong but plain. In the mornings the sound of iron came from the yard, steam rose from the stables, and the smell of bread from the kitchen softened the cold air. The child Merlin brought grew there under the name Arthur. Ector accepted him as his own son, and that acceptance showed itself not in grand speeches, but in the small habits of daily life. A place was set for him at the same table. The same teachers were called. He was allowed to fall and rise in the same yard. Because Arthur grew without knowing his blood, he did not think of himself as incomplete. Still, in every corner of the house, he noticed the privilege that seemed to belong naturally to Kay. Kay was Ector's true-born son. He was taller, quicker to anger, and his name was taken seriously earlier. Arthur's childhood passed not through bright miracles, but through patient tasks. Before he carried a sword, he cleaned swords. Before he rode horses, he learned their moods. Before he memorized the words of knighthood, he saw the tired faces of people who served. Kay sometimes treated him harshly. He gave orders with the air of ownership more than brotherhood, and he mocked Arthur when he was late. Arthur usually did not answer. When he was hurt, he went to the old oak at the edge of the yard, pressed his muddy shoes into the earth, and listened to how the words spoken inside grew smaller outside. His silence did not come from cowardice. He had learned early that something did not disappear because it was not said at once. Sometimes it went deeper. Ector loved the two boys in different ways. When he looked at Kay, he saw the continuation of his own blood. When he looked at Arthur, he felt the weight of a trust he could not explain. As Arthur grew, his face became more distinct. His open brow, careful eyes, and manner that had matured too soon set him apart from the other young men in the house. But Ector never spoke of that difference. At night, when the fire grew low in the great hall, Arthur sometimes noticed the man who stood in the shadow of fatherhood, looking at him for a long time. There was love in that look, but also a hesitation hidden under the love. Arthur could not understand it with a child's mind. Still, the most important lesson Ector gave him was that a person's strength was shown most clearly in how he treated the weakest. In later years, that lesson would be worth no less than any crown. Merlin appeared and disappeared through the years. Not everyone knew him in the same way. One day he might sit at the door like a tired traveler. Another day he might meet Arthur in the woods and ask why the birds had suddenly fallen silent. Arthur did not feel as though he were being tested in Merlin's presence. He felt more as if he had been led near the door of a room he did not yet know. Merlin did not speak to him of kingship. Instead, he told him that a lie could sometimes live longer than a sword, that a judgment made too quickly could return to its owner's house, and that courage did not always mean rushing forward. Arthur listened without fully understanding. Yet some words are not kept in a child's mind. They are stored in the place where he will need them later. When news of Uther's death came, the air was heavy. The message entered Ector's hall with the wet cloaks of men who had traveled far. The king was dead, and Britain was headless again. Kay grew excited at the news. He thought the time of great tournaments, new oaths, and rising names among the nobles had come. Ector's face hardened. That evening Arthur heard the silence around the table differently. People were not speaking only of a king's death. They were speaking of a kingdom falling again into dark roads. Some lords were gathering arms. Old rivalries were waking. Some priests wanted a great meeting in London. Merlin's name passed among the whispers, but no one knew from where he would come. Toward Christmas, everyone prepared to go to London. Kay stood on the edge of knighthood. He checked the straps of his armor, thought of how he would look in the tournament, and gave Arthur orders. Arthur moved beside him, not like a servant, but like one of the family. Yet inside he still wondered where his own place had been set. On the morning of the journey, Ector looked at Arthur carefully as he mounted his horse. His lips parted as if he had something to say. Then he gave up. When the towers of London appeared in the distance through the mist, the city carried people's hope and fear at the same time. Church bells spread slowly through the cold air. Arthur walked behind the crowd, not knowing that his life would quietly turn in another direction that day. On the road to London, Arthur paid attention to the faces of the village people they passed. Some spoke of who the new king might be. Others spoke only of the coming winter and the tax collectors. These simple conversations showed him that the kingdom was much wider than the halls of nobles. People who did not even know the names of those fighting for the throne would still live with the results. Arthur could not connect this thought to his own name, but a sensitivity formed in him that he would never forget. The question of who would be king was really the question of who would sleep safely at night. When they entered the city, Arthur noticed the waiting more than the stone buildings. Everyone carried the same question, but not everyone wanted the same answer. The nobles wanted their power protected, the priests wanted order preserved, and the common people wanted only for their doors not to be broken in the winter night. Kay looked at the crowd as if it were a stage on which he might be seen. Arthur preferred to pass unseen. Yet fate often calls the name of the person least ready to be seen into the center of the crowd. The cold stones of London waited calmly for that. Arthur passed through the city gate behind Kay, and in the murmur of the crowd, he felt a strange relief that no one knew his name. If he had known that this relief would end within hours, he might have looked longer at those stone streets. That morning, London was not only a city, it was the held breath of all Britain. Around the church, the horses of lords, the dark clothing of priests, the shining armor of knights, and the curious crowd mixed together. In the middle of the old stone yard stood a great stone with an anvil set on it, and from the anvil rose the hilt of a sword. When people came near, they first fell silent. Then whispers began. The words written on the stone declared that whoever drew the sword would be counted the true king of the land. The faces of the nobles changed when they read those words. Some saw it as a holy sign. Some thought it was one of Merlin's devices. Others felt it was humiliating for their own power to bow before such a test. Still, everyone wanted to try. All day strong men came before the stone. Some gripped the hilt with both hands, some prayed, and some pulled with nothing but trust in themselves. The sword did not move. Disappointment and wonder grew together in the crowd. When Kay realized that he had forgotten his own sword at the inn while preparing for the tournament, anger showed on his face. He turned quickly to Arthur and ordered him to find a sword. Arthur did not stop to weigh the command. He ran so his brother would not be embarrassed. The inn doors were closed, and he could not enter. On his way back, in a quiet corner of the churchyard, he saw the sword in the stone. At that moment, Kay's need mattered more to him than the words on the stone. He reached for the hilt and pulled the sword free as if he were taking a weapon from a hook on the wall. When Kay saw the sword, he did not understand at first. Then the shape of the hilt, the writing on the stone, and the murmur in the yard came together in his mind. He was about to say that he had drawn the sword himself. Ector's look stopped him. The old knight saw the haste on his son's face and Arthur's plain surprise, and he understood that the truth had already entered between them. The three of them returned to the stone. The sword was set back in place. Kay tried and could not draw it. Ector tried and could not draw it. When Arthur held the hilt, the sword came free again. At that moment, the sound of the crowd changed. First a murmur rose, then some knelt, and others stepped back. Arthur did not look at the weapon in his hand. He looked at Ector's face. The man who had raised him bowed before him for the first time. Arthur felt that bow not as victory, but as loss. It did not take Ector long to tell him the truth. He learned that Merlin had brought him as a baby, that he was Uther's son, and that he had been hidden from the court. These words made the home inside Arthur suddenly larger and stranger. Kay hid his shame behind hardness, but Arthur did not hate him. Since childhood he had stood in his brother's shadow, and now the shadow had suddenly changed direction. In Ector's eyes there was both pride and separation. Before Arthur wanted to hear that he was king, he wanted to hear that being Ector's son had not ended. When Ector told him that no love was measured by blood, the young man's surprise slowly became a heavy acceptance. Not all the nobles accepted the sign. Some pointed to the youth of the one who had drawn the sword. Some spoke of his hidden childhood and said Merlin must have had a hand in it. Lords who wanted to be king could not bear to step aside because of a miracle in a courtyard. For that reason, the test was repeated several times. On great feast days, at larger gatherings, before more witnesses, the sword was set back in the stone. Each time the same thing happened. Strong hands failed, and Arthur drew the sword. The people were convinced by repetition. The nobles were not so much convinced as worn down. At last, under the church bells, oaths of loyalty were sworn to Arthur. Yet while the sound of those oaths rose in the hall, some eyes did not lower. They looked not at the new king, but at the ambition still alive within themselves. When the day of coronation came, Arthur wore heavy cloth, and on his shoulders rested a responsibility that seemed too large for his youth. Merlin stood at the edge of the crowd. Ector watched quietly from farther back. Kay tried to turn his old pride into a more measured expression. Arthur carried beside him the sword he had drawn from the stone, but he already sensed that the true test was not drawing it once. It was deserving it every day. People bowed before him, prayers were said, and banners were raised. Still, when the ceremony ended that evening, all the lights in the city did not suddenly become trust. In the north and west, some kings began gathering arms. When Arthur spent his first night as king, he looked out the window and understood that a crown was not only something placed on the head, it was an invisible weight that set the unrest of an entire country inside a man. In those days, the relationship between Ector and Arthur also changed. Ector knew that he now had to kneel before him, but Arthur did not want his father to act that way. In private, he longed to be looked at as before. Yet life does not close a secret again once it has been opened. When Arthur kissed Ector's hand, some nobles in the hall were surprised. They did not find it usual for a new king to show such affection to a country knight. Arthur made one of his first silent decisions in that moment. He would count the house that had raised him, not as a shame, but as a root. He did not want to rise beside the throne by denying his childhood. After the coronation, Merlin found Arthur alone. He told him that the revealing of his blood was only the beginning, and that Uther's name would bring both strength and debt. Arthur did not ask whether he was responsible for his father's sins, but the question was clear on his face. Merlin told him that every person is born into the shadow of what came before him, but whether that shadow grows longer is his own choice. These words stayed with Arthur on his first night as king. Outside, some lords still muttered, and riders came and went through the city gates with news. At dawn, the young king would have to look not only at the sword that had chosen him, but at the people who would resist him. Arthur's reign had begun with holy oil and ceremonial words, but the lords of Britain did not easily abandon their habits. 11 kings saw the young ruler's name as a threat to their old rights. News from the north, oaths rising from western castles, and the private talk of old nobles soon became one storm. Arthur did not yet know all the roads of the kingdom, but he had learned to read fear in people's faces. Some villagers wondered whether the new king could truly protect them. Some knights debated whether standing beside him was wise. When Merlin said war was unavoidable, he did not say it with joy. He said it like a doctor naming a painful treatment. The openness left from Arthur's childhood faded from his face, and in its place came a stillness that hid his decision. During the preparations for war, Kay, Ector, and the knights who had offered their loyalty early stood beside him. But the greatest support came from beyond the sea, from the king's ban and boars. They looked not at Arthur's youth, but at his bearing. Their help did more than increase his army. It made Arthur feel that he was not alone. The armies gathered around Bedegraine and spread over wide meadows and forest edges. At night the fires trembled like stars, horses pulled at their chains, and young soldiers wondered what morning would bring. Arthur did not sit long in his own tent. He walked among ordinary men and looked at the faces of those he would send forward the next day. From a distance, the crown might look like gold. Up close, it felt as heavy as a promise made over other people's lives. When the fighting began, what needed to be told was not sharp detail, but the search for order inside a great confusion. Shields struck one another, banners vanished and appeared again in the wind, and commands were hard to hear in the morning mist. Arthur was not a young man swinging his sword in anger alone. He tried to see where he should draw back, where he should advance, and whom he should protect. Some of Merlin's old words gave him a strange calm in the noise. When the forces of Ban and Bors came to help at an unexpected moment, the order of the rebel kings broke. Arthur did not become drunk with victory. Among the defeated were not only ambitious men, but rulers who believed they were protecting their own people. The young king saw that painting them all with one darkness would be easy but incomplete. After the victory, prisoners were brought before him. Some looked away. Some still stood as if they were challenging him. Kay thought they should be treated harshly. He said a young kingdom could not stand without making others afraid. Ector waited in silence. Merlin did not even look at Arthur, as if he wanted to make it clear that the decision belonged to the king alone. Arthur believed he could build a stronger order by sparing rather than destroying. He demanded loyalty from the rebel kings, but he did not crush their honor completely. This choice did not comfort everyone in the hall. Some thought mercy was weakness. Others understood for the first time that the new king ruled not only to win, but to hold the country together. In those days, Arthur learned that family ties could be as complicated as wars. Lot's family, the young knights from Orkney, the children of Morgause, and old bonds hidden in the courts became clearer around him. The name Gawain first rose like a reliable light. He was young, warm-blooded, quick to bind himself to honor and also quick to anger. Arthur saw both strength and danger in him. Morgan also appeared in that circle as a quiet presence. She was not simply a woman with the eyes of an enemy. When she looked at Arthur, she seemed to see lost rights, secrets kept from mothers, and the shadow of an order built by men. For that reason, even her smile was not easy to read. Arthur was careful around her, because Morgan's silence hid something deeper than open hostility. After Bedegraine, Britain did not find peace at once, but its direction changed. Arthur's name was no longer only the name of the young man who had drawn a sword from stone. It was the name of a king who had stood after the noise of battle, spared the defeated, and remembered his friends. Ban and Bors returned to their lands, leaving him their loyalty. Kay felt differently when he stood beside Arthur. He no longer walked behind his brother, but beside his king. One evening, Merlin led Arthur to a hill away from the battlefield. Below them were the traces of dead fires and scattered tents. Arthur did not speak for a long time. The silence over the ground taught him that a kingdom was made not only of land won, but of people who never forgot how they were looked at after war. After the victory, Merlin spoke one of his hardest warnings. A child from the king's own blood would one day bring him great ruin. This was not told openly in the court, because its error came from the tangled and dark knowledge of kinship. When Arthur learned that a bond he had entered in youth without knowing would one day become the shadow named Mordred, the confidence he had gained at Bedegraine fell silent for a moment. Being king did not only mean defeating enemies, it also meant agreeing to carry the results that came from one's own past. The hardness on Merlin's face carried warning more than blame. Arthur's heart tightened at the prophecy. For a moment, he wondered whether an unborn or still unknown fate could be stopped by force. In old tellings, this fear reached toward a dark and painful order involving children born in May. Here, it remained quiet and veiled, like a stain left on the king's soul. Arthur would begin to learn that the person who tries to flee fate sometimes calls it nearer. Merlin knew this too, but he felt that not everything was in his power to prevent. The new King of Britain met his first great shadow of conscience just after his first great victory. The sword Arthur had drawn from the stone had been the sign of his choosing in the first years of his reign. But when it broke in a duel, the young king learned that signs also have their lifetimes. When the pieces of the weapon remained in his hands, those around him looked on with worry. Arthur did not see the breaking as only the tiredness of iron. It felt as if he had to leave behind at once his childhood, his astonishment in the London churchyard, and the brightness of his first oaths. The next morning, Merlin took him away from the crowd. They passed through misty hills, damp woods, and narrow paths where the birds woke late. Merlin spoke little along the way. Arthur had grown used to the old man's silences, because Merlin did not always give an answer at once. Sometimes he led a person to the place where the answer stood. Deep in the forest, the lake opened like a still mirror. Morning light lay over the water like a thin veil. When Arthur dismounted, even the sound of the air seemed changed. Leaves moved, though no wind could be seen. From the middle of the lake, an arm rose slowly. The hand held a sword whose shine fell into the water. Arthur did not step forward at once. Before taking such a gift, he tried to understand what it would one day ask in return. Merlin told him the sword's name was Excalibur. Yet Arthur's eyes did not rest only on the blade. He also looked at the simple workmanship of the scabbard. The Lady of the Lake appeared behind water and mist like a noble presence, neither entirely human nor only a dream. When Arthur received the gift, small rings spread across the surface of the lake. Excalibur did not rest in his hand like a shining weapon alone. Its weight was balanced, and its hilt fit his palm in a way he did not expect. Merlin told him to pay attention not only to the sword but to the scabbard, because the thing that protects can be more valuable than the thing that shines. Arthur did not fully understand the words then, but as he fastened the scabbard at his side, he felt a quiet unease. A sword could give courage, but knowing when not to draw it was a harder virtue. When the Lady of the Lake faded behind the water, Arthur bowed his head. He had never known a ceremony like that in a royal hall or on a battlefield. There was no applause there, only old silence. Soon after, Leodegrance's daughter Guinevere came into Arthur's life as queen. Her arrival was not only a marriage arrangement, it gave Camelot a center of grace and order. Guinevere did not enter the hall like a timid bride. She carried herself as a woman who knew the weight of the role placed on her. Her face had beauty, but her true strength lay in her composure. When she walked beside Arthur, her steps matched his. She did not fall behind him, and she did not try to move before him. People remembered that small detail. Arthur felt it too. Whether their marriage began as great love or not, there was a firm ground between them built by mutual respect. That ground would one day be tested, but in the first days it brought a real softness to the peace of the kingdom. With Guinevere came the Round Table, a gift from her father and a sign that suited Arthur's dream more than any throne. Around that table, no knight sat at the head, and no seat declared one man greater than the rest. It did not erase rank or rivalry, but it gave those things a form that could be governed. The first night the knights took their places, a short silence fell after everyone sat down. In that silence, old wars, oaths, lost homes, and new hopes seemed to enter the same circle. Arthur kept his speech brief. He asked his knights not only for courage but for self-command. He said that the strongest man did not always need to strike first, and that sometimes the hardest victory was stopping an injustice before it grew. The first true law of Camelot was not written in gold letters. It was written that night in the way people looked at one another. Guinevere sat beside Arthur and understood that this hope was not light. When people believed in a dream, the weight of that dream settled quietly on the shoulders of those who carried it. Merlin appeared only briefly during the wedding feast. As singers performed, knights raised cups and fires burned in the outer yard. The wise man's face remained thoughtful. Arthur wanted to ask whether this new order would last, but Merlin seemed to know the question before it was spoken. No table, he said, was stronger than the hearts of those who sat around it. The words did not vanish inside the celebration. They settled in Arthur's mind like a small stone. The beauty of the Round Table would depend on how true the people around it could remain. The gates of Camelot began to open not only to nobles and messengers, but also to the older stories of the island. One morning, a young man named Kulhuch came to court. His face held the courage of distant kinship, and his eyes carried the thin weariness of someone who could not reach the woman he loved. He wished to win Olwen, but her father, Isbadadin, had set before him tasks that seemed beyond human strength. Arthur did not take the request lightly. Sometimes a young man's love could open the oldest doors of a kingdom. Kai, Bedivere, Gawain, and chosen knights rode with him. When they left the stone yards of Camelot, a well-ordered court lay behind them. Ahead waited the country of ancient trees, marsh paths, and forgotten names. On this journey, Arthur did not command like a king. He listened. The language of old Britain could be understood with patience, more than with a sword. As Isbadadin's demands were named one by one, the excitement on the young knights' faces gave way to quiet amazement. Marbon had to be found, and the memory of that long-lost youth was held not by men, but by animals and rivers. The great boar Twrch Traeth had to be hunted, and the comb and razor he carried had to be taken. These were not ordinary wedding gifts. It was as if the world itself demanded its old secrets back from those who wished to reach Olwyn's door. Arthur did not laugh or scorn the tasks. He did not try to solve them by strength alone. Kai's hard and useful patience, Bedegraine's calm attention, and Gawain's warm courage completed one another on the road. Arthur saw the true meaning of the Round Table more clearly in those valleys. People gathered around the same oath did not have to carry the same nature. The hunt for Tuatha Trith lasted for days. Branches rustled in the woods, horses' breath turned to steam in the cold air, and the voices of dogs moved away between the hills and returned again. Danger grew not through graphic force, but through the weariness of the road and the shifting shadows in the mist. When Kai wanted to rush forward, Bedegraine's measured look steadied him. When Gawain grew too eager, a small sign from Arthur brought the movement back into order. No one owned the story alone on that search. Each person shone for a moment, then made room for another person's labor. The grace of the Round Table, learned inside a hall, was being tested in mud, rain, and waiting. Arthur understood that his kingdom would grow not only by making laws, but by enduring the hardness of the old world with restraint. Every question asked of the aged animals slowed the journey, but deepened its meaning. A blackbird seemed to tell old time by showing the stone worn down by its beak. A stag, though his antlers had renewed themselves, had not forgotten certain names. An owl, with a gaze as old as night, turned the company toward another trace. At last, the knowledge of an eagle led them to the water, and the knowledge of the water led them to the back of a great salmon. Arthur felt there that kingship was not only rule over men. A king who did not understand the land would also understand its people incompletely. With the salmon's help, they drew near to the place where Mabon was held, and Kulhooch's voice returned for the first time to the hope he had hidden since childhood. The one who had been lost was not only a man, he was the unfinished link of an old story. Mabon's rescue was not a loud conquest. When the silence of the closed place opened, even the air outside seemed wider. Arthur remembered that moment for a long time. To bring someone out of captivity or out of being forgotten could be a greater victory than taking a fortress. With Mabon's return, the hunt for Tuatha Trith stopped being a scattered chase and became a task with direction. For days they crossed coasts, river mouths, and stony passes. Some knights grew tired and others impatient, but Kulhooch never wished to turn back. Arthur saw in his stubborn devotion the pure fire of youth, an openness he feared he might lose with time in kingship. So the road reminded Arthur not only of old tales, but of the simplest desire of the human heart. When Olwyn finally appeared, the air of the story changed. Her beauty did not sound like a loud enchantment. It felt more like spring preserved inside a dark house. It was said that flowers opened behind her steps, and Arthur saw in this not only a miracle, but a language of hope still living among cruel conditions. Kulhooch's weariness eased when he came near her. When the tasks were done, Isbardaden's fear withdrew into its own shadow, and the path of the young lovers opened. Arthur did not carry this success as another victory for his own fame. He thought that removing an unjust barrier from a person's path sometimes gave a king the cleanest honor. Kai's rough loyalty, Bedegraine's quiet skill, and Gawain's sincere joy made the road home warmer than any feast. When they returned to Camelot, the court heard not only news of a distant adventure, but of a new bond with the island's old roots. Guinevere noticed less what Arthur told than the weariness on his face. While he had been away, she had kept the order of the court steady by listening to envoys, wounded families, and women at the gate. Camelot had grown by two roads, Arthur through old tales, Guinevere within stone walls, carrying justice without bruising it. Morgan listened to these stories in silence. The nearness of old magic to Arthur neither pleased her nor fully angered her. It showed her that an inheritance she thought she had lost was taking shape in other hands. From that day on, Arthur did not forget that Camelot had been built not only for the future, but for the half-finished voices of the past. Every knight around the Round Table now owed something not only to Arthur's command, but to the unseen memory of the island. Lancelot's name reached Camelot before he did. It was said that he had been raised near the lake, that even as a young man he had no equal with weapons, and that the way he sat a horse looked different from ordinary knights. On the day he entered the court, it became clear that the rumors were not empty. He was tall, finely made, and measured in his movements. In his eyes there was not the eagerness of someone seeking victory, but the tired attention of a man who kept testing himself. When Arthur first saw him, he did not see only a strong warrior. He seemed to see a person who could carry the ideal of his kingdom. When Lancelot knelt, the movement was flawless, but when he raised his head, a brief loneliness crossed his face. Guinevere noticed it before most people in the hall. Arthur did not test Lancelot at once with a heavy duty. First, he watched his conduct in the court. Lancelot was not rude to servants, answered young knights with patience, and did not let praise brighten his face too much. But when the tournament came, his skill could not be hidden. His horse seemed to change direction with his thought, and before his lance reached its mark, the crowd already felt the result. Gawain looked at the new knight with both admiration and careful rivalry. Kay, despite his old sharp tongue, gave him his due. Arthur's face showed open satisfaction. Camelot seemed to have found one of the brightest names in its own story. The first nearness between Guinevere and Lancelot did not happen like a great scene. After an evening meal, when the departing guests left a soft noise behind them, the Queen spoke a few words with him. Lancelot's eyes looked directly at her, but not for too long. It was as if he were drawing a fine line between respect and attention. In this manner, Guinevere saw not flattery, but an inward order that restrained itself. For years she had sensed either admiration or advantage in the eyes of most men who looked at her. In Lancelot's look, there was something beyond both, a depth trying to hide itself. That night, neither of them gave it a name. It only slowed Guinevere's steps for a moment as she left the hall. Lancelot's first great deeds soon began to be told. He rescued prisoners, defended those falsely accused, and broke the power of cruel lords who blocked the roads. Each time the stories returned to Camelot, they were told more brightly. Singers enlarged his name, and young knights began to take him as an example. Yet with every return, Lancelot seemed to draw more deeply into himself. Arthur thought this was humility, and he loved it. The king saw the presence of such a man at his side as a support given to his kingdom. As his trust in Lancelot grew, he treated him more closely. In private speech, he accepted him not only as a knight, but as a friend. That trust honored Lancelot, but it also left within him a tension no one yet heard. Guinevere saw more of Lancelot as his fame grew, yet the weight of this part of the tale did not lie in an open confession of love. It rested in hidden movements. Sometimes when Arthur spoke Lancelot's name, Guinevere turned her face toward the light in the window. When Lancelot entered a hall where the queen sat, he placed his steps more carefully. There had been no spoken word between them, but sometimes unsaid things take up more space. Arthur did not see this silence, or when he did, he gave it the name of trust. That was one of Camelot's strongest qualities. People had grown used to seeing one another through high ideals. The same habit would make them slow to notice the danger near them. On the day Lancelot was given a place at the Round Table, the hall gained a new balance. When he sat in his seat, some knights greeted him with a nod, while others measured his growing fame. Arthur did not need long praise in his speech. He said Lancelot's deeds spoke for him. Guinevere watched the ceremony with a calm face. Morgan, from a distant corner, saw the new bond and sensed the powers within Camelot shifting. To her, people gave away secrets not only by what they said, but by whom they looked at. That day Lancelot's name was added to the brightness of the kingdom. On that same day, under that brightness, a line appeared so fine it could not yet be called a crack, but deep enough to trouble every stone in time. When Lancelot took the sorrowful castle called Dolorous Gard, and it was renamed Joyous Gard, his fame grew still larger. People began to see him as a knight who could change not only people, but the meaning of places. When the dark name of the castle was lightened, singers called it a blessing of Lancelot's arrival. Lancelot himself felt that such stories cut a garment too large for him. It was easy to change the name of a place. Changing the name of the dark rooms inside one's own heart was harder. The thought was not yet clear in him, but it would grow clearer as he drew nearer to Guinevere. The friendship between Arthur and Lancelot did not remain only the tie of king and knight. They spoke on hunting rides, long journeys, and in the quieter hours of the court. Arthur felt that the loneliness he had carried since youth grew a little lighter beside Lancelot. Lancelot carried the king's trust as an honor. That trust was the cleanest bond tying him to Camelot. When his silent feeling for Guinevere began to grow, the conflict in him was therefore too heavy to be reduced to a simple forbidden desire. A person can sometimes fear hurting the two things he loves most at the same time. The distant look that sometimes crossed Lancelot's face was the first shadow of that fear. When Morgan Le Fay came to Camelot, the air around her changed. Her beauty did not carry open light like Guinevere's. It was more like the cold shine of an old mirror kept in a closed room. As Arthur's sister, she had a place in the court, but that place did not close the distance inside her. She did not trust Merlin because she thought the order he had helped build tried to quiet the voices of women and old magic. When she looked at Arthur, she saw both her brother and a king who had risen outside her own life. For that reason, she stood near him as neither full enemy nor full kin. Guinevere noticed the fineness in Morgan's words. Every sentence had one meaning, and beneath that meaning another door. Morgan's greatest move formed around a knight named Avalon. Avalon was devoted to her, not only because of enchantment, but because she had given him the feeling of being seen. Morgan wanted to take Excalibur, and especially its scabbard, away from Arthur. The blade's light drew every eye, but Morgan knew that the protective power lay in the scabbard. During a hunt and the strange hospitality that followed, Arthur was drawn into an order he did not understand. Sleep, mist, and deceptive gifts mixed together. The next day, the king found himself inside a duel arranged by other hands. The man before him held the true Excalibur. The weapon in Arthur's own hand was only a look-alike. During the duel, Arthur felt not only danger but a strange lack. With every move he understood that the weapon in his hand was not truly his, and that without the scabbard at his side, his body was more exposed. Avalon fought bravely because he did not know all the darkness behind the role he had been given. The two men tired themselves inside a scene made by someone else without fully knowing each other. When help from the Lady of the Lake, or from the order around her, revealed the truth, Arthur's face showed deep astonishment before anger. Before him stood not simply a knight, but the test arranged by a woman of his own blood. Avalon's end was not carried by harsh detail, but by a fading devotion and the feeling of courage wasted. When Arthur learned of Morgan's betrayal, he did not immediately name her a simple enemy. His hurt was more tangled. What would be easy to punish if done by a stranger became tangled with the past when done by family. Morgan withdrew with her people through forest roads. No regret could be read on her face. Yet at one point she stopped her horse and looked back toward Camelot beyond the hills. There were her mother's story, her sister's fates, and a place she had never fully possessed. That was why Morgan's hostility was not a cold line. It was a dark weaving of very old knots. Arthur did not announce the loss of the scabbard to the people. Fear would grow if they knew their king had been weakened. But Bedegraine and a few close knights noticed the change in his movement. Arthur stood more carefully in duels now. He feared not only being wounded, but having grown too used to the old belief that he was protected. The change was useful to him in its way. He learned to carry himself not behind a magical assurance, but inside his own judgment. Still, at night, when his hand went to the empty place where Excalibur's scabbard had once rested, he felt that Morgan had thrown not only an object into the water, but also the comfort of his young kingship. Morgan's shadow also changed the way Arthur looked at Guinevere. The king thought that the danger from his family might also surround his queen. When Guinevere sensed this, she showed him that she was not someone to be protected only by fear. When they spoke of Morgan, she did not raise her voice, but she reminded him that broken women can become dangerous not only through magic, but through words no one has heard. Arthur had no easy answer. That day, Guinevere saw more clearly the delicacy of court politics, and Arthur saw how little he had looked into the silent world of women. After this event, Arthur did not try to erase Morgan completely. He did not forbid her name or deny every memory of her. He sensed that such denial would resemble the concealments Uther had once made. Instead, he accepted Morgan's existence as a dangerous but real kinship. This acceptance did not comfort him, but it made him more honest. He did not know whether Morgan would return, but if she did, she would find before her not only a deceived brother, but a king who now saw the shadows of his own family more clearly. This was the quiet end of the child's innocence inside Arthur. One evening, returning again from the lake, he watched the moonlight on the water for a long time. The scabbard was not visible there, but its absence remained in his mind like a second story living under the surface. In this way, even after Morgan left the court, she left a mark that could not be erased from Arthur's reign. That mark was both a warning and the painful reminder of blood. Even in Camelot's brightest days, Merlin never seemed fully settled in the court. He walked the stone corridors, sat beside the king, and listened to the words of knights. But in his eyes, there always remained a distance that came from roads, forests, and old waters. For a long time, Arthur thought this was simply Merlin's nature. He had grown used to the wise man's sudden arrivals, to the way he could untie a knot with one sentence, and to his power to sense what others did not see. Then the old man's silences began to change. He no longer kept silent only to listen. He seemed to be hearing a door inside himself slowly close. The young woman from the lands around the lake was called sometimes Nimue, sometimes Vivian. She changed the air around Merlin not only through beauty, but through her careful gaze and a mind eager to learn. Nimue stood near Merlin as more than a student. She stood like a boundary. The old wise man taught her the memory of trees, the words hidden in stones, and the deeper meanings water carried beneath its surface. Nimue listened with wonder, but with each lesson she also felt the weight of the power being given to her. Merlin's interest in her was not a love ruled completely by reason. It held the last light of old age, the late warmth of loneliness, and the desire to leave what he knew to someone who could carry it after him. When Nimue sensed this, she was afraid. Even the closeness of a wise man could sometimes build an invisible room around a person. She did not want to be lost inside that room. Merlin did not act like someone who knew his end in advance. He acted more like someone walking slowly toward an end he knew. The final scene in the deep forest did not happen as sudden anger or open reckoning. There was no wind among the trees, yet the leaves trembled lightly, as if an old word had awakened under the ground. As Merlin walked beside Nimue, he noticed that the path did not resemble any path he knew. Some tellers left him inside a stone, some inside the silence of an unseen tower, and some in an enchanted closing between sleep and death. Yet, however the form was spoken, the heart of it remained the same. Merlin withdrew from the world. What Nimue did not seem like a cruel victory. It seemed more like protection mixed with fear. In Merlin's last look, there was more tired understanding than accusation. The forest did not grow larger. The sky did not darken. The birds did not cry out. Only the sounds became fewer, and the old wise man's name slowly moved away from the places where living people spoke. When Arthur first heard that Merlin had not returned, it did not feel like a clear report of loss. It felt as if he had been left in a long waiting. For days he looked for Merlin's shadow in half-open doors. Whenever a matter was debated in court, there was an empty place toward which everyone wanted to turn. Sometimes the king paused before deciding, then continued as if he did not want others to notice the pause. Merlin's absence did not make him weak, but it took from him a support he had carried since childhood. Kay noticed this through an uneasiness hidden behind his harshness. Bedivere began to speak more carefully. Guinevere saw that even in a crowd, Arthur sometimes seemed to listen to an old forest road. The absence spread through the walls of the court not by shouting, but through small delays, longer silences, and a new weight on the king's face. One evening Arthur went alone to the shore of the lake. Excalibur rested beside him, but he did not draw it. On the surface of the water there was only his own reflection. No hand rose, no old voice gave counsel. The lake that had once brought him a gift, then taken the scabbard from him, now stood before him with a deep silence that reminded him of Merlin's loss. That evening Arthur understood that magic could not be called by one name. The same world could give a person a sword, take away his protection, and draw his most trusted guide into an unseen distance. The king did not grow angry at the water, and he gave no final judgment on Nimue. But when he returned from that shore, he knew that no prophecy would protect him from every cost. He would carry Camelot not in the future someone else knew, but in the decisions he chose. Nimue's name was never wholly cursed and never wholly cleared. Some remembered her as the woman who took Merlin. Others said Merlin had walked into his own fate. Arthur did not try to resolve the uncertainty. The faces of the old world were many. Morgan's anger, the Lady of the Lake's gift, Nimue's fearful decision, and Merlin's silent acceptance all stood in the same misty circle. Camelot had been built on stone, law, and oath, but along its edges the language of water, forest, and unnamed powers still moved. Merlin's voice could no longer be heard, but whether the things he had taught were true would now be tested in Arthur's life. When the king understood this, he began to carry the wise man's absence not only as loss but as a late inheritance. On one of Camelot's most splendid days, an unexpected silence fell in the hall of the Round Table. The knights were in their places, banners hung like heavy cloth from the high walls, and the light through the windows left soft lines on the stone floor. That day young Galahad was brought to the Siege Perilous, the empty seat that only the purest knight could fill. His face carried lines that resembled Lancelot's, but his eyes were calm, like clear water, far from his father's inward conflicts. When he entered the hall, no one spoke long. His presence seemed like an answer that did not ask for praise. Then the light of the Holy Grail appeared. No one could hold it fully, and no one could see every detail. Yet after that light passed, everyone felt more clearly what was lacking within himself. The knights swore that day to seek the Grail. Arthur felt pride as their vows rose, but also deep sadness. He knew that the brightest faces around the table would leave one by one. The Grail was not a prize to be won on a battlefield. It was a call that reached into the most closed place of the soul. Galahad answered without hesitation. Percival's young innocence and Bors' measured loyalty found their place beside him. Lancelot also rode out, but even on his horse he carried what he left behind. Guinevere chose her words carefully as she saw him off. Arthur looked at his friend with trust, and that look made Lancelot's silent burden heavier. The roads of the quest separated the knights. Some came to dark castles, some to poor monasteries, and some to passes whose names no one remembered. Where Galahad passed, the tale did not grow harsher. It grew simpler. He moved not as if he were winning glory, but as if he walked a road prepared for him before his birth. Percival was tested by his haste. Bors had to choose between brotherhood and duty. Lancelot's road was made heavy, less by outward obstacles than by the division within him. When he came near a chapel, the strength in his knees failed. Waiting before a door, he understood that his heart was not fully clean. No one humiliated him in these moments. Lancelot silently saw that even his greatness could not carry him all the way to the light he sought. For those left in Camelot, time moved differently. Arthur did not stare at the empty seats, but he felt their absence in the work of the kingdom. Men who would once have been called at once for a task were now on distant roads. Guinevere kept the daily order of the court. She listened to women who came for help, received envoys, and went to church. Yet the absence of the knights thinned the sound of the halls. There was no long news of Morgan. Merlin's absence was remembered again during this time, but no one had to mention it in every conversation. It was already in the air. Late at night, when Arthur passed through the hall of the Round Table, he saw the empty chairs not as a warning, but as a prayer. The quest for the Grail enlarged the glory of the kingdom, yet it also quieted its center. The final light reached by Galahad, Percival, and Bors was something to be felt more than told. Ships, white cloths, the holy vessel, and a deep peace became a moment where human words reached their limit. Galahad's completion of his earthly road meant separation more than victory for those who remained. Bors would return and tell what he had seen, but what he told would never be the whole of what had happened. Lancelot returned carrying his failure. But failure here was not cowardice. It was a great man facing himself. As he came near Camelot, everyone still spoke his name with respect, but he could no longer walk as comfortably inside himself. After the Grail quest, the Round Table seemed the same, yet it was not. Some seats remained empty, some faces returned changed, some laughter did not return at all. Arthur welcomed his knights and looked at each one separately. In some he saw light, in some weariness, and in some a loss that could not be described. Guinevere watched Lancelot's return from within the crowd. There was no large gesture between them, but the silence brought back by long journeys drew them toward each other more clearly than words. That evening Arthur prayed at the table. He had wanted the Grail to raise the kingdom higher, but greatness sometimes carried people a little away from the world. Camelot's hall was still beautiful, but its beauty now seemed more delicate. Bors was tested differently. When he stood between love for his brother and the innocent people he had to save, his heart seemed almost torn. Knighthood sometimes meant not running to the person you loved most, but accepting pain while choosing the more rightful duty. This measured loyalty brought Bors near the final light with Galahad and Percival. Percival tried to keep his innocence on the road. He had the openness of someone still able to wonder at the world. These three moved as different but completing faces of the Round Table. Galahad carrying the light, Percival the innocent search, and Bors the grave devotion. Lancelot's return was a complicated joy for Arthur. His friend had come back alive, but something in his face had been diminished. The king did not ask many questions. Some journeys write their tale in a language a person can hear only within himself. Guinevere sensed this too. The old courage still stood in Lancelot's eyes, but that courage no longer seemed enough for him. The Grail quest had not separated them. It had made the name of what they hid sound deeper. That name was still not spoken. While the hall celebrated the return of the knights, another return began inside some hearts, a return to the place from which they could no longer flee. The news of Galahad's departure from the world, or his rise into heavenly peace, echoed differently in everyone who heard it. Arthur saw in him the sign of an ideal his kingdom wished to reach, but could not hold. Lancelot received the knowledge that his son had gone farther than he had with both pride and sorrow. Guinevere sensed in it a purity that did not belong fully to the world, and beside it the complexity of her own life felt heavier. The Grail did not bring Camelot a crown of victory. It made each person see himself in another light. That light was beautiful but not easy. Even the songs after the Grail were different from the old ones. Singers no longer told only of victories. They told how journeys stripped a person and left behind a more naked soul. Camelot listened in silence. Not every returning knight had seen the same light, but all sat at the same table with a little more weight. No one was as he had been. The faces of those who returned from the Grail quest carried change more than victory. Galahad's name moved through the court like a purity almost impossible to reach. The stories told by Percival and Bors reminded everyone that knighthood was not only courage, but the ability to look into one's own darkness. When Lancelot returned, he was quieter than before. People still saw that he was the strongest knight, yet they felt that the old ease inside that strength had gone. Arthur made no open accusation. Years of trust still stood between them. Guinevere did not turn away at once when she saw him, but her gaze did not remain as long as before. Nothing was spoken loudly in the court. Still, some silences were beginning to attract more attention than words. Elaine of Astolat entered the story during this time with a fine and sorrowful light. When the young woman saw Lancelot on the road to a tournament, she was drawn not only to the fame of his name, but to the loneliness in his tired face. Lancelot was not cruel to her. He showed kindness, carried the token she gave him, and yet he knew that there was no place in his heart that could open to her. Elaine did not understand this at once. Sometimes a person wants to read another person's kindness as proof that the heart has turned in the same direction. Lancelot could not find words for the confusion inside him. His silence looked like hope to Elaine. The same silence was a dangerous shadow to Guinevere, and for Lancelot it was a corridor with no exit. When Lancelot fought in the tournament without revealing his name and carried Elaine's token, he left a mark that would later be misunderstood at court. For him, the token was mostly courtesy, gratitude, and perhaps a wish to step away for a short time from his own name. For Elaine it seemed like a silent answer, given before the whole world. When Lancelot was wounded, the young woman watched over him with a heavy patience. Sitting beside the injured knight, She noticed that even in sleep he remained silent around another name. This realization did not kill her hope at once. Hope sometimes lives for a while, even after it has seen the truth. As Lancelot healed, the light in Elaine's face faded. The man who was healing would go where he had always been bound to go. The house where she would remain stood behind him like a door that would not close. When Guinevere heard that Lancelot had carried Elaine's token, she could not receive it calmly. Because she was queen, she did not enlarge her anger before everyone, but those near her sensed the coldness in her voice. She had no right to claim what she had never openly named, and that made her anger harder to carry. Lancelot felt both wounded and guilty. He had not meant to deceive Elaine, and yet he had not spared her. He had not betrayed Guinevere openly, and yet he had wounded her. He had not turned against Arthur, and yet everything inside him moved toward a place Arthur could not bless. In that knot, even kindness could become a wrong path. Elaine's grief found its final voice in the boat that carried her to Camelot. Her body came down the river in silence, with a letter that told what her living voice could not. The court received the sight with a stillness that no song could soften. Lancelot stood before the sorrow he had not meant to cause. Guinevere saw not a rival, but a woman whose hope had been consumed by a love that had never been returned. Arthur saw how the glory of his greatest knight could cast pain into places beyond his intention. No one spoke of Elaine lightly after that. The river had brought not accusation alone, but the image of a heart that had loved without being answered. This grief had not yet settled when another danger came around the Queen's name. Meleagrance, a knight with old envy and a restless pride, set a trap for Guinevere while she traveled with her ladies and guards. His plan did not have the cold patience of Mordred's mind. It carried the haste of a man who wanted to possess what he could not honor. Guinevere met the danger with controlled dignity. She knew that fear shown too openly could strengthen a weak man's cruelty. Her attendants were frightened, and the road that had seemed ordinary suddenly felt narrow and watched. Word reached Lancelot, and he came with the urgency that made people see him as both savior and danger. Lancelot rescued the Queen, and Meleagrance was exposed, yet the event did not bring a clean ending. From the outside, Lancelot's devotion could be called the duty of a knight. But the eyes in the court now weighed every movement with another meaning. Arthur thanked him because he had protected the Queen. That thanks did not ease Lancelot. The king's trust could sometimes be heavier than accusation. Guinevere, too, felt her name living in whispers, not spoken by her own mouth. A woman's honor could be worn down even by the quietest looks. Gawain disliked the air around the court. In the attention of his brothers and kin, he saw an ugly haste. But evil does not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it waits and watches people reveal their own weaknesses. Mordred was more patient than anyone in that waiting. He watched Arthur's trust, Guinevere's tired dignity, Lancelot's service that tried to look flawless, and Agravain's anger. In his mind, these were no longer court rumors. They were threads that could be tied together. Agravain wanted open accusation. Gawain tried to stop him, sensing that such a step would break the table. Mordred spoke less and saw more. Elaine's silent boat and Meleagrance's ambush had made the Queen's name more often spoken in closed rooms. Mordred let people first hear suspicion, then grow used to it. One night, he stood with Agravain in a long corridor. Torches trembled on the stone walls. No doors had yet been struck, but the heaviest door of Camelot had already begun to open from within. Behind it waited not only the hidden meeting of two people, but a night when the friends Arthur had seated at the same table would bear witness against one another. Mordred knew it. Agravain no longer cared where his anger would lead him. Outside the court, the night was calm. Inside, the trust that had once joined the knights in a single oath had begun to thin like an unseen blade. The waiting in the stone corridor became an open plan within a few days. Agravain could no longer keep suspicion inside himself. Even the years of service Lancelot had given the kingdom seemed to him no barrier before the coming accusation. Gawain tried to stop him. He said that the anger of one night could tear apart the fellowship built over many years. Mordred spoke less and moved more. There was no warmth of youth in his face. He measured his words and used people's fears with care. When they learned that Lancelot would come to the Queen's chamber, they prepared their men quietly. Guinevere was deeply uneasy that night. When Lancelot came, there were no long explanations between them. The light in the Queen's room was low. The wall hangings moved slightly in the wind, and from time to time steps could be heard on the stones outside. Lancelot felt that he could no longer carry in the same body his loyalty to Arthur and his love for Guinevere. Guinevere knew that her choice was drawing not only her heart, but the kingdom itself toward fire. When the movement outside the door became clear, neither of them was truly surprised. They understood that the thing long approaching had finally reached the door. Agravain's voice spread through the corridor. The accusation entered before the door was opened. Lancelot's escape did not happen like a loud scene of heroism. It was the last movement of a closing world. The door was forced, and loyalties divided at once. Lancelot defended himself, but no form of defense could restore innocence now. Some knights fell that night. The tale carried their end not through harsh detail, but through the names missing when morning came. Agravain's anger called its own end. Mordred survived wounded enough to carry the news to Arthur. The silence left in the Queen's chamber was the silence of a broken oath. Guinevere would now stand judgment, not only as a woman with a heart, but as queen. When Arthur heard the news, his face aged at once. No one heard him shout. That did not make the pain smaller. It made it heavier. As the law spoke of the Queen's punishment, a whole life divided inside Arthur. On one side stood Guinevere, who had been beside him for years. On the other stood the order of the kingdom, which had to appear equal for all. Lancelot's escape made the accusation larger. Gawain was shaken by the loss of his brothers, and his old respect for Lancelot hardened under family grief. When Guinevere was taken toward the day of judgment, she did not lower her head, but there was no victory on her face. In that moment the Queen carried the gaze of all Camelot. Lancelot returned. His return was not only the rescue of the woman he loved, it was also the public announcement of his own failure before the kingdom. As the sound of horses drew near, the order of the crowd broke. Lancelot's men took Guinevere away. In the confusion, some of Gawain's brothers did not return. This loss turned a private scandal into an inner war of the Round Table. When Arthur learned that the Queen had been rescued, he was not only a husband who had lost his wife, he was a king whose law had been broken by his closest friend. Gawain's grief grew like fire. Every word that imagined forgiving Lancelot sounded to him like forgetting his brothers. The halls of Camelot did not look empty that night, but the trust inside them had withdrawn. Lancelot took Guinevere to Joyous Gard. There he protected her, but protection did not bring peace. Behind the high walls, Guinevere did not feel saved so much as drawn into a deeper debt. There was resolve on Lancelot's face, but in his eyes stood a break from which there was no return. As Arthur prepared for war, every friendship from the past became a separate weight. Gawain pushed him forward. Justice, honor, and family grief now flowed in the same direction. Mordred watched all this quietly. To him, the strongest people in the kingdom had begun consuming one another. When Arthur gathered his army, the morning wind moved through the gates of Camelot. It did not carry the smell of victory. It carried the coldness left behind a king who had to depart from his own home. When Arthur had to give judgment, the laws of old kings forced him into a narrow passage. If he spared Guinevere, he would seem to bend justice for himself. If he allowed punishment, he would cut one of the oldest bonds of his heart with his own hand. His pain showed not in great speeches, but in small movements. Before he pressed his seal, his hand paused for a brief moment. The attendants beside him did not look at his face. Everyone understood that kingship could leave a person in the loneliest place. Guinevere also saw Arthur's loneliness, and that made the weight of her own wrong heavier. To hurt someone one loves can leave a deeper mark than harm done to an enemy. Lancelot's rescue and the unintended deaths of Gawain's brothers during it changed every possibility. Until then, there had still been a narrow place inside Arthur reserved for peace. Gawain's grief closed it. The matter was no longer only the rescue of the Queen. Families had been broken. The warmth in Gawain's face withdrew. The generous knight of good heart became a hard man shaped by pain. When Lancelot heard what had happened, he took no joy in his own success. He had saved Guinevere, but he had cut some of the deepest bonds of Camelot. As he rode toward Joyous Gard, what he left behind was not only the field, it was his old life. Arthur's decision to make war on Lancelot was therefore not only a matter of law. The king believed he had to repair before the whole country the trust broken inside his own house. Yet the path chosen for repair would create new breaks. Taking Guinevere back, punishing Lancelot, quieting Gawain's grief and preserving order in the eyes of the people did not all seem possible at once. When Arthur mounted his horse, there was no expression of victory on his face. This campaign was unlike any he had won in the brightest days of his reign. Sometimes a person goes to his heaviest war, not toward an enemy country, but toward his own past. That night the stones of Camelot remained in place. Its towers were not fallen, and its gates still closed. But trust, the true home of the kingdom, had shifted unseen. By morning, not everyone knew it, but everyone felt it. The shaking appeared first not in the tallest towers, but in the way people looked at one another. In those looks, the old road of trust had closed, and return remained only inside memory. When Arthur crossed the sea in pursuit of Lancelot, the shores of Britain slowly grew smaller behind him. The soldiers on the decks were silent, because this campaign was different from wars against old enemies. Before them stood Lancelot, the man they had admired for years, beside whom they had fought, and whose name they had given to children as an example. Gawain stood motionless at the front of the ship for a long time. Pain had become anger in his face, and anger had become the only pillar holding him upright. When Arthur stood beside him, he could find no words. Lancelot's wrong was great, but his past service was too deep to erase. This contradiction tired the king before the war even began. The siege of Joyous Gard was long and heavy. Lancelot did not act like a man who wanted victory over Arthur. Behind the walls of the castle, he defended himself, tried to prevent needless losses, and still spoke the king's name with respect. This respect did not calm Gawain's anger. It made the pain sharper. The two great knights faced one another more than once. Each time, Lancelot showed that he had the strength to defeat Gawain, yet he would not bring himself to destroy him. To Gawain, this mercy felt like humiliation. Arthur saw after every encounter that peace had moved a little farther away. People who had once sat at the same table now wounded one another more deeply because they knew one another so well. Religious envoys from Rome finally brought a call for peace. They asked that Queen Guinevere be returned to Arthur, that Lancelot withdraw to his lands, and that the war stop. Lancelot accepted the peace. He sent Guinevere back not with a grand display, but with heavy remorse. When Guinevere came before Arthur, there were few words left between them. The king looked at her and saw not only betrayal, but all the beautiful and difficult years she had shared at his side. There was no pride on Guinevere's face. In leaving Lancelot, she felt not that she had been saved, but that she was leaving behind the last beautiful bond of an age. Arthur received her, but nothing returned to its old place. Even after the peace, Gawain did not release his anger toward Lancelot. The loss of his brothers was a door that would not close inside him. Arthur had to return to Britain because the news from the island was worsening. Mordred, left with authority in the king's absence, had gone beyond it. He spread word that the king was dead or would not return, and he tried to take the throne. Some nobles believed him, some wanted to believe him, and some moved toward the side that looked strong. Mordred did not act like a simple liar. He used Arthur's long absence, the people's weariness, and the broken honor of the court to make room for himself. The gates of Camelot were being forced again, not from outside, but from within. Guinevere resisted Mordred's effort to keep her as queen beside him. She withdrew into a tower in London, or into a holy refuge. This choice was an important turn in her story. She no longer wanted to be defined by another person's love or by the king's name. She chose to carry her remorse in her own silence. For Mordred, this resistance was an obstacle, but not one he could break at once. When Arthur received this news while preparing to return, the direction of the war changed completely. He was no longer pursuing Lancelot. He was returning to his own throne, his own country, and a threat born from his own past. Gawain was badly wounded, and his anger was slowly fading. In his final days, He passed through enough pain to tell Arthur that he should ask Lancelot for help. Gawaine's last message left in Arthur's heart a clarity that came too late. It had taken too long to understand that Lancelot was not only an enemy, but a lost friend. The sea journey back was darker. When the shores of Britain appeared, Arthur was not returning to the country of his youth, but to a tired and divided island. Mordred had gathered an army. The people were caught between two names. On one side, the old king already becoming legend. On the other, a cold air promising a new order. When Arthur stepped from the ship, Excalibur was at his side, but the scabbard had been lost years earlier. No one said this aloud. The king set foot on his own land, the wind struck his face, and the fate of Camelot was left one last time in human hands. When Gawain was badly wounded, his pride cracked quietly for the first time. Lying in his bed, he thought about how far anger had carried him. He did not forget the loss Lancelot had caused his brothers, but he also saw that the kingdom faced a greater danger in Mordred's betrayal. So in his last words dictated to Arthur, he asked him to seek Lancelot's help. This late softening did not change Gawain completely. It only opened a small place for justice inside pain. When Arthur read the message, he closed his eyes for a long time. If only some truths did not come so near to a person's last breath. Mordred did not stand alone in Britain, because empty places always call someone. Arthur's long absence, the shame left by the Guinevere scandal, the knights falling upon one another, and the weariness of the people had prepared the ground for his words. He showed himself as young and decisive. He said the old king belonged to the past, and that the country needed a new hand. Some lords saw in his words not the future, but their own profit. Still, they joined him. Mordred's kingship rose in this way, not through great love, but through the gaps left by broken trust. Even when he took the throne, there was more calculation than true loyalty around him. In the place where Guinevere had taken refuge, the days passed slowly. Every report from outside came to her as both fear and a waiting she felt she deserved. She heard that Arthur had returned, that Mordred gathered strength, and that Lancelot remained far away. The Queen was no longer at the center of events, yet the waves of her past choices still struck everyone's life. This taught her the bitterest lesson of queenship. Even when a person leaves the stage, the result of her decisions remains on it. While Guinevere prayed among stone walls, Camelot's fate moved along roads she could not reach. The sea on Arthur's return was grey. As waves struck the side of the ship, the king remembered the misty roads he had once traveled with Merlin in his youth. Then an unknown crown had stood before him. Now a broken kingdom lay behind him. No one sang on that journey. Everyone felt that the return was not a rescue, but a door opening onto the last reckoning. As the coast came nearer, the feeling grew heavier. The return belonged not only to the king, but to the whole island, and no one knew the result. The plain of Camlann was covered before dawn by a heavy mist. The wind moving among the tents stirred the banners slowly. Soldiers spoke in low voices, and horses scraped the earth uneasily. Arthur woke early that morning. In the night he had dreamed of Gawain. The old knight had warned him not to fight and told him that if he waited, Lancelot could arrive. The dream was not the kind that vanished after waking. It stayed over the king and settled in his chest like a cold stone. Arthur asked for a meeting with Mordred. Both sides would appear to lower their weapons, and no one would draw a sword unless the agreement broke. This decision was the last effort of a king still looking for a place for peace on the edge of war. When Mordred came to the meeting, he did not look young. Ambition can harden a person before his time. Arthur searched his face for a line of his own blood, but what he saw was more the shape of shadows gathered over many years. As they spoke, the men around them waited tensely. No one fully trusted anyone. Then a soldier saw a snake moving in the grass and drew his sword to protect himself. The flash of steel became the sign both armies feared. One small movement, misread by fear, set loose the disaster that had been delayed for days. Commands tangled, men rushed forward, and order disappeared inside the mist. The Battle of Camlann began not with grand words, but with a small gesture that terror had misunderstood. The story of the battle needed no harsh detail. There was enough pain in broken banners, in horses searching for their riders, and in names lost in the mist. As Arthur moved across the field, every face seemed to return some part of the past to him. Some were young men who had once listened to tales of the Round Table. Some were weary men who believed Mordred's promises. Some had followed only the lords they served. The pain inside the king was greater than anger. Mordred did not retreat. For him, this battle was not only the taking of a throne, but the forced claiming of an inheritance never freely given to him. By noon, both sides were exhausted. When the mist lifted, the plain's true silence could be seen. Arthur and Mordred finally faced each other. Around them, the world seemed to narrow. Good and evil did not stand there as a simple line. On one side stood a king with failures. On the other stood an heir raised in the shadow of those failures. When Arthur looked at Mordred, he saw not only treason, but the return of secrets he had not faced in time. In Mordred's face, there was hunger for victory and also a deep deprivation. The last blows were brief. Both were badly wounded. When Mordred fell to the ground, the noise of the field had already grown faint. Arthur remained standing, but his standing was not the sign of life so much as the sign of one last duty. Only a few faithful men remained near him, and among them Bedivere came close with wet eyes and a voice that could hardly speak. Arthur asked that Excalibur be returned to the lake. Bedivere took the sword and went away, but when he reached the water, he could not throw it in at once. What lay in his hand was not only a weapon, it was the young king's choosing, the mornings of Camelot, the oaths, the losses, and the light of an entire age. The first time he came back, he lied. Arthur asked what he had seen when he threw the sword. Bedivere said he had seen nothing, and the king knew he had not done it. The same weakness came over him a second time. On the third, Bedivere understood that his loyalty was no longer to keep the sword, but to obey the king's final command. Excalibur turned toward the water. A mysterious hand rose from the lake, caught the sword, swung it 3 times, and drew it down into the deep. When Bedivere returned, he found Arthur near the shore. A boat was coming through the mist. Inside were grave women in dark clothing, and Morgan was among them. Her presence there no longer felt sudden. Morgan had been angry with Arthur, had harmed him, and had tested him. Yet in this story, joined by blood and old magic, she had a place at the last threshold. There was no victory on her face. Perhaps some kinships carry the wound in life and the crossing at the end. Arthur was lifted into the boat. Bedivere remained on the shore and watched the king's fading shape. The name of Avalon seemed to move inside the mist. No one could say with certainty whether Arthur had died. The boat drew away. The water grew calm and Britain's greatest king disappeared from sight. Before Arthur was taken into the boat, he left Bedivere one last thanks with his eyes. His words had become few. The kingdom no longer needed long sentences, but silent acceptance. Lucan's loyalty remained behind as a painful memory. Mordred's ambition sank into the silence of the earth. Gawain's warning had been proved true, though too late. Far away, Lancelot still had not arrived. That delay became one of the story's greatest sorrows. Sometimes the right help comes only when it can no longer change the result. As the boat moved toward Avalon, those left on the shore watched not only a king disappear over the water, but every delayed possibility of peace. The silence left by the shore after Arthur was taken to Avalon became the first silence of the legend. Bedivere stood there not only as a man, but as the last witness who would carry the tale. For years he would repeat what he had seen, yet each telling would leave some details in the mist. Perhaps the boat had truly been there. Perhaps the light on the water had been a final dream between death and life. For Bedivere, the difference no longer mattered. The king was gone. What remained was the task of telling his name without lying and without using it up. That task would last longer than throwing Excalibur into the water. Camlann was no longer only the name of a place. When people said it, they remembered how a misunderstood movement, a postponed peace, and a friendship that came too late could bring an ending all at once. Even after Arthur's disappearance, that memory settled over the island like a fine mist. After Camlann, Britain could not make the same sound for a long time. The roads opened, but travelers walked more slowly. The court still stood, but the weight of missing names moved through the halls. The stones of Camelot still received the sun, but that light now fell on another age. The chairs around the round table had become more than furniture. They had become signs of lives to be told. Different words spread about Arthur's return. Some said he was being healed in Avalon. Some said he would come back one day in the country's darkest hour. Others thought that kings departed like other men, leaving behind only what they had made and what they had broken. Whatever people believed, Arthur's name did not disappear from daily speech. There were kings after him, and in some stories Constantine was remembered as a ruler who tried to gather order again. Yet no new ruler filled the emptiness Camelot had left in people in the same way. Those who wanted justice remembered Arthur. Those who swore oaths wished to resemble him. Guinevere withdrew from the world. Within the calm walls of a convent, the garments of queenship gave way to plain cloth. Her repentance was not a display. It was a slow road, made of walking each morning on the same stone floor, repeating the same prayers quietly. and remembering the past from another corner each day. It could not be said that she had not loved Arthur. It could not be said that she had not loved Lancelot. Her tragedy lay in the fact that two loves could not carry the weight of a kingdom at the same time. The years did not teach her how to defend herself. They taught her to see what had happened more clearly. Sometimes, looking out the window, she remembered the first mornings of Camelot. The stones had seemed newer then, the faces younger, the oaths easier. Now all of it remained like distant music between prayer and remorse. Lancelot too eventually withdrew from the world of battlefields and tournaments. When he wanted to see Guinevere for the last time, he no longer carried the brightness of the old knight, but the bare conscience of a tired man. The queen received him, but the conversation between them was not meant to reopen the past. It was meant to see it honestly enough to close it. Lancelot had been called the greatest knight of his life, yet in his own eyes he had lost his greatest test. Guinevere told him she would remain apart from the world. When Lancelot heard this, he did not object. Some loves end not through union, but through learning not to cause further harm. He too turned at last toward a religious life and left behind the noise around his old name. People would still tell stories of him, but he had walked into a silence that no longer wished to be told. Bedivere carried for years the weight of having obeyed Arthur's last command. When he remembered Excalibur returning to the water, he did not forget why his hand had failed the first 2 times. That moment had shown not only his own weakness, but the desire of all people to hold on to legend. No one easily accepts that a great age has ended. Bedivere was remembered sometimes among monks, sometimes as a quiet man near the roads. When people asked him about Arthur's end, he gave no certain answer. He told them that the boat had vanished into the mist, that women had taken the king, and that the lake had returned to its old calm. Even that was enough to make the eyes of listeners grow large. Legends live on not when every detail is explained, but when a little mist remains within them. Morgan's name also did not remain in one color in later tales. Some called her traitor. Some thought of her as one of the last women of magic. Others saw her as the dark kinswoman who brought both wound and closure to Arthur's story. Perhaps the truth was not fully in any one of these, but partly in all of them. She had stood against Arthur, tested him, and weakened his power. Yet her place in the boat to Avalon showed that old stories were wider than the human heart. Hostility, kinship, magic, and fate had met in the same water. The world after Camelot tried to simplify this complexity, but Arthur's story grew weaker when simplified. What made it powerful was that it carried its shadows beside its light. Years later, a child asked an old singer whether Arthur would truly return. The singer did not answer at once. First he stirred the fire, then listened to the wind outside. He said that Arthur's return might not only mean a boat coming back through the mist. Perhaps his name woke again whenever a king acted justly, whenever a knight used his strength to protect the weak, or whenever a person chose not to draw the sword in his hand. The child did not fully understand, but in the firelight he imagined the round table, the hand in the lake, the sword in the stone, and distant Avalon. The night deepened. The singer fell silent. Outside, the wind of Britain passed over the old roads, and Arthur's name continued to live in the dark. less like a fairy tale than like a word that had to be remembered. For this reason, Arthur's story remained not only the story of warriors and kings, but also the story of those who regretted, those who waited, those who came too late, and those who still dreamed of a better world. Guinevere's prayer, Lancelot's silence, Bedegrane's hesitation at the shore, and Morgan's strange place in the boat to Avalon kept the legend from becoming only one lesson. People found both warning and comfort in it. Camelot had fallen, but telling of its fall made new kings, new knights, and ordinary people face the same question. What will you use power for when it comes into your hands? And so Arthur's story did not end exactly where it ended. Every generation rebuilt it, yet in every rebuilding the same questions returned. How just can a king be? How faithful can a friend remain? When does love become ruin? How late can a mistake be forgiven? No final answer was given. Perhaps that was why Arthur still lived. Final answers are forgotten, but true questions remain inside people for a long time. The crown behind the mists therefore remained not only a story of the past, but a story of the human heart. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero. Love